What's up, football fans? Lindsay, Rhodes, and Sam Bruchhaus back together again for the Sticky Stat series here on the SumerSports Show. It's our last one of this series. I think we've run out of positions to talk about. Today we are going to talk about pretty much the entire defense. So maybe we're biting off more than we should have the ability to chew in a digestible time frame. But before we even get into that, welcome back, Sam. It wasn't the same without you last week. We had fun with Bob Wiley and Adam did a great job. Did a great job filling in for you. But we missed you.
Yeah, I made a little trip to France, and on the train from the north of France to the south of France, I think I may have been the only person, listening to Bob Wiley say "Set Hut" and texting you, Lindsay, over and over again with every thought I had and every idea, and the way to combine, technique that Bob was talking about with the actual view from, the way the Cowboys look at it, the way we look at it at SumerSports that Adam was bringing. And it's so interesting to look at the offensive line, because the closer to the ball you are on offense, the harder it is to understand what they're doing, and thus the harder it is to make sticky stats. And so it was awesome, the back and forth between y'all three. And then I'm really excited to kind of take some of those insights and implement them for, clients of SumerSports and for fans of SumerSports and followers of all the fun work that we're doing.
Yeah. I mean, not to go into a full pitch for Sumer right now, but I do think that's one of my favorite things about Sumer is the fact that we have like a data arm, and we've got the football scouting side that has a more traditional upbringing in football and certainly looks at the game, through like they're just watching the players on the field, not necessarily consulting the data first and then putting the two into conversation with each other. And so I think all the things that you're saying there are super fun in terms of looking forward into what we can do in the years ahead, talking to coaches and evaluators and saying, okay, you're looking at it this way. How can we turn what you're specifically looking at into a trackable number and just something that we can tangibly look at? And not everything can be turned into something like that. And as we've learned throughout this series, a lot of things can't, frankly. Almost everything that is a number still requires a lot of context. And that is also true for the things that we're going to talk about today. In a lot of cases, we're going to go through the different defensive players. We'll try and break it up into groups, and then we'll put in the description for the podcast and the YouTube video when we put this live there, or not live, but when we put it thereafter, we'll try and put some time codes. So if you're looking for specifically like stats related to cornerbacks, we'll tell you where you can, jump ahead and look at that kind of stuff. But we're going to go defensive line, edge rushers, and then we'll talk about cornerbacks and a lot of coverage stats. And then we'll talk about safeties and linebackers in a different bucket. And the reason that they're last is because they're hard. And kind of like running backs, there's a lot of circumstance and context needed. And so it's harder to find specific numbers for those two groups, correct?
Right. The funny part, given, what I just said, the closer to the ball on offense, the harder it is to tell what you're doing, is on defense is the exact opposite. The further away from the ball you are, the more difficult it is to realize what you're doing. So for some of those DBs, the observations come once the line has blocked, the quarterback has made a decision, the wide receiver has run his route, and then you're in action. And that's when we really get to make some of those core observations. We're hoping with some of the artificial intelligence we're investing in, we can find more juice to squeeze out of every single play. But it's just different when those players are only targeted 4 to 5 times a game. Meanwhile, edge rushers or defensive linemen are really in the thick of it every single play. And so that's why it's kind of the flip of the offensive side of the ball, just because there's a lot going on that has to happen in order for a cornerback or a safety, in particular safeties, to really be involved in a play.
True. I think, without getting into the cornerback conversation now, I think I disagree to a degree about that position being particularly hard to judge. I just think it's an untraditional way to look at it. I think we almost need to flip it upside down. And then, but we'll get to that conversation in just a second. Let's start in the trenches, as we talked about, and also including linebackers who are generally edge rushers here, like the Micah Parsons of the world, probably.
Right.
And let's discuss before we actually get to that, I should reiterate once again, in case you are new to this series, what we mean when we say sticky stats, because this is not necessarily like these are the stats that tell you that they're good, which you might think. How would you describe what is sticky when we say this stat is sticky?
So there's two pieces to a sticky stat. Number one, we're assuming that the player will get to what we call volume, which means in the case of these defensive players, they'll have enough defensive snaps, pass rushing attempts, coverage attempts, whatever their position or role asks of them, in order to get to a number that we expect an observer to understand how good that player is. So that's item one. And then item two, it means how well, if that happens in 2 back-to-back years, will it be the same in the next year? So take a player, you just mentioned Micah Parsons. We're assuming that Micah Parsons had a lot of rushes last year, which he did, and that he'll have a lot of rushes this year. Given our understanding of how much he is pass rushing, how effective was he last year, and that gives us a sense of how much he may be this year. And that's what a true sticky stat is. And we really see that with the edge rushers and defensive linemen in particular.
Yeah. Sometimes these sticky stats can just be, this number is one that we can expect to be consistent year over year. Like we talked about wide receivers a few weeks back, ADOT is one of those. That doesn't necessarily tell you anything about the player's talent. 100%. But if their average depth of target is, 6 as opposed to 12, that's telling you a story about the type of wide receiver they are, where on the field they typically are targeted. And that is likely to be consistent year to year to year with regards to that one individual player. Right. So keeping that in mind. Okay, now starting with the players closest to the line, as you said. What stands out to you as being most sticky in this area?
So I think what's really interesting, but also shows why defensive tackles who can rush the passer and edge rushers who can rush the passer are so valuable, why they're considered probably the second, if not the first, premium position outside of quarterbacks, is because pass rushing stats are quite sticky. You look at our pass rushing Sumer score in the 70s for defensive tackles. Like if a player is good this year, they are almost certainly going to be good next year. You look at things like pressures. We do a great job of identifying when people are disrupting the quarterback. That's in the 60s. So these type of ideas of how they're disrupting the quarterback is pretty sticky. Here's the caveat. And really coming off the back of talking with Bob Wiley, Coach Bob Wiley, and talking about how the sack is really the thing that causes negative plays on the offensive line. Ironically, sacks per pass rush or sack rate is not that sticky. So what this kind of means is the ability of an edge rusher to get to the quarterback will probably maintain year over year over year on a per play or per pass rush basis. However, there's all kinds of random stuff that can happen with sacks. You can have an interesting schedule where you play a lot of mobile quarterbacks, or you could, not finish particularly well, which is very key, but it's very hard for us to predict. And so that's kind of why you see pass rushing ability be such a valuable tool and so valuable in the draft and free agency, because we can predict it next year pretty well.
Yeah, that makes sense to me too, because whether you're able to finish the play almost feels like, look, if you're getting a ton of pressures, chances are good that you're going to have a larger number of pressures that are finished off in the form of a sack, right?
Right.
But to me, I almost want to grade the process. And I understand what Bob Wiley was saying about offensive linemen, that if I hand him a box score, that he's going to sacks first, because that's the one that in a box score form actually hurt his team the most, right? Like a pressure is concerning because it's a sign of process breakdown, that he was getting beat at some point, but maybe he was able to hold off. I'm talking about the offensive lineman. Now I'm flipping it. The offensive lineman was able to hold off the pass pressure just long enough that the quarterback was able to get the ball out. But in terms of process, I'm interested in the pressures allowed, because it's telling me that there's something here where more often than not, something that you're doing is impacting the quarterback. in some type of way. And whether or not that quarterback allows himself to get sacked or it goes that far, maybe he has to speed up his throw. Maybe he has to, throw at a weird arm angle in order to get the ball off or something like that. None of those are ideal. So I would assume that the same is true, I think, for me. And I think what you're saying here in terms of edge rushers, it's the process that I'm most interested in. It makes sense to me that would be more sticky year over year.
Right. And I like the way you describe it as process, because when we think of finishing ability, we typically, just on a broad scale of defense, think about missing tackles. So what a true, missed tackle would be in the context of pass rushing would be you get a hit on the quarterback, but you don't end up getting the sack. That's not really the case when we look at the metrics. Quarterback hits per pass rush is substantially less sticky than pressures, which indicates that the hits and the sacks have some type of extra context, likely the quarterback or likely the scheme that they're playing against. Whereas pressures are a better result of, or a better show of, a player's true impact on the game. And you can really go down and look at players like Trey Hendrickson or some of these players at the top, and you can see the kind of fluctuation in their sack numbers by 2, 3, 4, 5 sacks a year. But the pressures are almost always going to be in the high 20s or 30s. And that's why that process, as you said, Lindsay, matters so much.
Let me ask you about this in terms of the way that these numbers are impacted by other people on the line, the environment. Like we've talked, for years, I feel like Max Crosby's an example that comes to mind, where like there were a number of years where like put somebody on the line with him, you know what I mean? So that he's not getting double teamed. And so he has an opportunity to really finish and get some of those numbers up. There are going to be certain people that are in that type of a situation where they just don't, we say all the time, like your best edge rusher is many times only as good as your second best edge rusher, right? So that then they're freed up. And so how can we judge consistently if we're looking at those types of numbers for someone who's in that situation? How different does someone like that look in some of these lists if we're talking about rates, pressure rate, sack rate, stuff like that?
It's an excellent point, and I want to highlight the Pittsburgh Steelers on this in particular, because TJ Watt is going to line up where TJ Watt is going to line up, and you're going to have to deal with him all game. But on the flip side, Alex Highsmith typically has an excellent pressure rate. And so the question becomes, how much of that can we, identify, move over to that player? But to that point, allow me to point people to like someone like Jonathan Grenard, who moved from the Texans to the Minnesota Vikings and maintained an excellent pressure rate. And so I think there is kind of a stickiness to the player themselves, even though then you once again kind of have to double down and say, well, did Andrew Van Ginkel have something to do with that? But it's a completely new defense, a completely new interior defensive line, yet you continue to see the same production. So just based off of what I see, I'm inclined to think that it actually is pretty sticky to the player. It can just perhaps be supercharged a little bit by who may be lining up on the other side of you.
And it makes sense to me that the first thing that you went to are the pressure rate, for instance, right? Any of these, rate being important more so than the total, because we want to know how frequently you're asked to do something, right? Like your job on the field is now how many pass rush situations are you in? We can count those now. And then how frequently, when you are pass rushing, are you successful at it? Are you leading to a pressure or a sack or a hit or a hurry or whatever? I want that rate as opposed to the total personally. Especially if I'm looking for someone, as we are in some of these stats, we're looking for people who are good before we know they're good, right? You want people, sometimes they're not going to get as much opportunity. You want to know, hey, maybe this person should get more opportunity because they're doing really good when we give them an opportunity. So, I mean, it probably goes without saying, but that's why I feel like the rates are more important here than the total stats. Do you agree?
I 100% agree, especially because there's 30 to 40 passes a game. And ideally, you want your defensive players out there every single snap rushing the passer. That's the most important play of the game when it comes to passing. And it's the easiest way and quickest way to disrupt the pass is obviously getting to the quarterback. And so you mentioned identifying players who may have some type of latent skill. This is not necessarily an elite player, but Chase Young bounced around but maintained a pretty good pressure rate. The questions on him were more about effort in the run game, which we can get into shortly. The run game is a little less sticky than the pass game when it comes to defensive linemen, and injury. And sure enough, he maintained a similar pressure rate moving to a Saints team, which did not have pass rushers at the level of Nick Bosa. He was typically lining up across from either Carl Granderson or Cameron Jordan, who has gotten up there in age, though is still effective. And then he was able to maintain a good pressure rate and lock down a pretty good contract for himself. So I think that's why these rates matter so much. As long as you can get, as I've talked about, to volume, as long as you can get, 100 or so pass rushes in a year, those rates really matter a lot more than just the raw number.
We also have some tracking data, right? Here at Sumer, the pass rush Sumer score, some of those types of things. What have you found when you look through those numbers?
So when it comes to pass rush Sumer score, which is kind of taking a scout's eye and blending it with our AI, we see some real sticky stuff. And I think the reason why is because a pressure is very subjective. When people are charting pressures, the statisticians are charting pressures. It's very much like the assist in basketball, where everyone knows what a pressure should be, but it can get pretty loosey-goosey at some point. The AI is going to apply the same thing time and time and time again. And I think that's why we get a little bit more stickiness out of there. And in particular, we'll even, cut the frames down so that we're not looking at the entire play. We're looking at where the player lined up and his probability of pressure at that point, and then what happens either when the ball was thrown or the play ends via a sack. And that gives us an even better look, even though it is slightly less sticky just because it's a little bit smaller of a time with less context, but it is still quite sticky. It's like literally, we're talking about 3 or 4 percentage points there. So realistically, not a massive difference. And you're able to cut it into this key window. And really, this is the only place, maybe other than wide receivers, where we're able to cut it into the key window of the most important thing that a player is doing in the pass game. And that is disrupting the quarterback here. We're able to get a great objective and key here, more objective than even the normal statistician look at it using our AI and tracking data.
Who are some of the names that are at the top of that list?
This is a place where the eye certainly meets the AI. When we look at defensive tackles, names like Chris Jones pop up. Names like Quinnen Williams, Dexter Lawrence, Nnamdi Madubuike. These are some of the best defensive tackles in the league. Eye meets the AI. All of a sudden, we understand why they are so good, and we're able to look at players who can be like that in the future. And defensive ends, again, regular suspects: Myles Garrett, Nick Bosa, Micah Parsons, Trey Hendrickson. Those were some of the top guys. And so then what we kind of want to do is identify who else is good at this, because this may indicate that they are developing. Yaya Diaby is a guy who we really loved. Udit Ranasaria, one of our chief machine learning guys on our team, pointed that out all year and was saying that perchance the Buccaneers defense may improve because of the level of pressure he was getting. That ended up happening. Nick Bonito, a guy who, last year was considered a pretty good pass rusher, all of a sudden becomes an all-pro this year. And you start seeing names like that, and it starts to show the real stickiness, which is Nick Bonito all of a sudden becomes an all-pro level pass rusher. Trey Hendrickson all of a sudden becomes a defensive player of the year. If you were just more of a casual fan, maybe you didn't get a sense of that. But we can kind of project this out going to next year. So maybe look out for Yaya Diaby if you're a Bucs fan as a guy who could make a massive impact next year.
Dude, so if we can start name checking Bucs defensive players on the reg, because the way that offense is looking right now, then this could be a team that could be real scary next year. What about, before I move on to the run defense stuff, is there anything else from a pass rush standpoint that we need to check off here?
I think there is one kind of minor statistical thing that I do want to mention here, and that is how weird the stats are when it comes to sacks. And the idea that we give people half sacks is not really necessarily sensical. Like, we'll give multiple people half sacks in the box score. Obviously, that's not what we're doing here at Sumer Sports when we're using AI. We're really, figuring out how much they are impacting the play. But I do want to kind of like give a degree of salt to our listeners, I guess it's the best way to say it, is because I really care just if you were disrupting the passer. I don't really care if it's a half sack or a full sack or this, that, and the third. Obviously, there is a slight difference, but if you're getting to the passer and you're bringing them down, that's what I really care about. And so just kind of keep a close eye on some of those half sacks and full sacks and the major differences. A lot of people said last year Nicky Bosa didn't have a great year. Perchance that was because of some of those half sacks and some of those weird statistical errors, given that his pressure rate was really high and given that his Sumer score pass rushing was really high as well.
It's really fascinating to me. I understand why we do it, so this is why I think you and I both really wanted to do this series. I think that we're in, as I've said a bunch of times, a really interesting inflection point when it comes to ways that we can tangibly track NFL play, right? Like, from a stat standpoint, we have just seen a boom of advanced stats in the last few years. And I think that a lot of them and conversations like this have really highlighted why some of the traditional counting stats that we have long relied on to tell us who's the best are just off. Like, obviously, interceptions, we can all think of examples of, interceptions that were not the quarterback's fault, but there they are on the quarterback's line. That's true for, as we talked about last week, sacks, not always an offensive line stat. And so I think that it's really interesting here that we move away from maybe just like a total sack total. And that's how we are going to decide who the defensive player of the year is. Like, it's just such a weird number. And I get why we do it, because that's ultimately the goal. You want to take down the quarterback, but the person who takes down the quarterback the most is not necessarily, sometimes it is, but it's not necessarily, that's not the story of who was the best edge rusher on the season. So I want us to kind of ideally, like I'm going to, control this, but in a perfect world, why we're doing this is so we can help kind of nudge away from some of those stats and into a direction of some of the stats that we have that more completely tell the picture of what's happening on the football field. And that's some of the beauty of what we have with like the AI, as you've mentioned, and some of the tracking data stats and all of the advancements in technology. Okay. So from a run defense standpoint, I would imagine that a lot of this is sort of similar to the running game. It's that like there's so much environment there. How do we track that?
It is and it isn't. I think that when it comes to just the sheer sticky stats, this is over a 50% correlation. So there is some stickiness there, particularly when it comes to interior defensive linemen. I think the reason why that is because when you are lined up in those A and B gaps, in those 0, 1, and 3 techs, you are being asked to eat up blocks. And that's kind of the job across the league, other than for a few certain schemes. Your job is to keep people free, to fill up gaps, and then probably to make tackles for loss and things like that. It is substantially less sticky for edge rushers where scheme really starts to kind of flip up. Are you spilling? Are you forcing? Are you doing all these different types of techniques? Are you a 3 down front? Are you a stand-up guy? This is where all of those edge rushing, or, the guys that are lining up in the 5 techs or wider, starts to get a little weird. So in essence, I think we actually do identify really good interior run stuffers pretty well. You look at guys like Grover Stewart, who was awesome. Again, Quinnen Williams, who had a pretty good year last year. DJ Reed. Like, these are guys who are good players. Jeffrey Simmons comes up. Leonard Williams, of course. But when you start looking at the edge rushers, it does start to get a little bit harder. And the guys who typically pop up are the guys who play a little bit more, standard 5 tech or can bump inside. For example, Calais Campbell is a defensive end who always comes up as a good run defender, probably because he is being used kind of all over the line and has a lot of has a lot of flexibility. But some other names that come up, Greg Russo of the Bills, Will Anderson, another good pass rusher, Khalil Mack. Like, these are all guys who I think are used in a certain way at the edge position. if they were used differently, would they be as good of a run defender? The correlations and the aggregates seem to indicate that we couldn't count on it, even though they are excellent players. But that's kind of how run defense breaks down. Very good for interior defensive line. We're able to get some signal. Edge rushers, there's a lot of context that matters as well.
Help me come up with a checklist here, because I think some of the things that you just mentioned are really interesting and have my brain spinning about ways that we can do this.
Yeah.
What's a checklist that you would go, okay, how can we figure out what are some of the different filters that we could put this through to say this guy is asked to stop the run? And now let's figure out how good he is at that. Like you mentioned some of them there. What are some of the things that you would want to check off?
So, especially as a former defensive player, this has been a fascination of mine for a very long time. And I think when you are, for example, looking to evaluate players from the draft, a guy who I really liked 2 years ago was Johnny Newton out of Illinois, and he lined up all over the place. I think you have to get a sense of where the player is lining up in terms of their technique. Are they always a zero? Are they always a nose guard? Are they playing 1 tech and 3 tech and 5 tech all the way? And just like for clarity, when I'm mentioning all these things, 0 is head up on the center. 1 tech is shaded off of the center, but you're still in that A gap, the first kind of interior gap off the center. 3 tech is just 1 over right outside of the guard. And then depending on what defense you're playing, you play a 4-eye, which is kind of head up on the tackle or on their inside eye, which is why it's tagged. 5 tech is outside of the tackle. And so you want to get a sense of alignment of the player, and then you want to get a sense of how often they are asked to align at those places and their effectiveness at each of those alignments. And I think
this might be obvious, but just to follow up in case it's not for somebody, which of those numbers there signal run?
So typically nose guards are asked the most to be run defenders because at any given point in time, you have 3 players who are going to block you. It's going to be a little difficult to push the pocket unless you are extremely good as Dexter Lawrence is. And that's why Dexter Lawrence is considered one of the primo players in this league to pass rush from the 0 technique. Also, that's where we see guys who are getting up in the 330s, 340s, 350s, the Vince Wilfork types, who are pretty much just asked to play the run. Moreover, they're typically going to be, take up some space. They're typically going to be asked to play on 1st or 2nd down, and they'll probably come off the field on 3rd down. Once we start getting into the 1 tech, it's generally the same, but if you're playing both 1 tech and 3 tech, particularly in a 4 down front, that means that, you're not going to have, 5 guys. We're talking even fronts here. You're going to be dropping a couple more guys. Those are still probably run first players, even though they will be asked to push the pocket to disrupt players like Aaron Donald was. And then as we continue to get outside, you become more of a pass rusher type player, at least as it comes to the NFL, where you have your guys like Hassan Reddick, who are pass rush specialists, for example.
All right. Okay. So we're looking at alignment.
Exactly.
As a primary filter here. Okay. Is that everything we need to know about run defense for the guys up front?
Yeah, I think so. And I think, something that we didn't necessarily look into here, but your ability to play against play action, and particularly your ability to figure out what is going on in a play, is something that we can't really pick up per se through AI, but that's something that I would really lean on the scouts to kind of note down, given their understanding of scheme. And I think that's kind of the thing that's missing here. However, because the results are pretty quick when it comes to run defense and pass rushing for defensive linemen, we are able to get a lot of signal from those things.
All right. So those are the guys up front. Moving on to the guys on the other end of the defense. We're going to skip the guys in the middle for the most part right now and come back to them. I want to talk about the guys that are in coverage mostly. Let's talk about the cornerbacks. I think that this one's very interesting. And I'm curious to hear what you have to say. And then I have a lot of thoughts about the way that I look at this specifically. I think that this one's a tricky one in terms of how to gauge from a numbers standpoint.
It's very tricky. When it comes down to it, there is not a ton of sticky stats for cornerbacks.
Okay.
I think the reason why that is because it's so low sample not necessarily because we're not doing a good job of describing what's happening. And the reason I say it's so low sample is because, a quarterback can just decide to not throw to a side of the field. And that may change over the course of if players get injured, and that may change if you're playing a different scheme. And there's just so many things that have to happen in order for a cornerback to get targeted in the first place, which is the first result that we have to see. And I think that's kind of the reason. It's just low sample size. I think if we were to look over this, 2, 3, 4 years, maybe we'd start to see some real stickiness. But over the course of just 1 year, it's tough to glean any stickiness from a host of stats.
So for me, that's why I think what I was alluding to earlier is that in a lot of these cornerback stats, I want to flip it upside down, because what you're ultimately like, if you step back and you said, what am I asking my cornerback to do? Like, if I were to pick the perfect cornerback, what's happening on the field? And for me, it's a guy that when the quarterback is surveying the field and trying to figure out where he can throw the ball, he has to look away from that guy. That guy, wherever he is, has his guy locked down, or for whatever reason, we're not throwing at him. And so this is the upside down number, where actually low numbers can be a sign of a good cornerback, because you don't want someone throwing at him all that much. It was like back in the day with the whole Revis Island thing, right? Like you have to look at it through that prism. And so for me, it's like, look at the number of snaps that you're actually in coverage situations, then look at the numbers in terms of targets that are coming at you, maybe catches that you're allowing, and then turn those into a percentage. Like and so if you have a high number of snaps per target, for instance, then that's probably a good sign that you're on the field a ton. So this isn't a fluke. It's not just that nobody's throwing at you and your target number is low because you're never on the field. You're on the field a ton and they're never throwing at you. Right. There's got to be more there, right? Like that's something I'm looking for that's telling me a story, that something that person is doing is good.
Right. I think this is very similar to the offensive line, where we get a sense of that they're doing something good. We just can't get a sense of whether they will continue to be doing that good thing. I guess, if that makes sense. And so,
you don't think so?
Well, talking about like defensive target rate, so the amount that a player is targeted per coverage attempt or per time they're in coverage, just doesn't necessarily have a super high correlation. Now, the reason I think that is because, number one, cornerbacks can align in multiple different places, which adds an additional amount of context as compared to the other kind of hard to parse out place, which is the offensive line, where a left tackle is going to play left tackle. If he's good at left tackle, he's not moving. To where a cornerback could follow a wide receiver all over the game. He could maintain the same spot, or they could have game plans where they're running a lot of cover 3, and then other game plans where they're playing a lot of cover 2. And moreover, just from an eye perspective, it's pretty hard to figure out. As defenses have evolved, we moved from what we call spot dropping, which is almost like you're playing zone in basketball. You're just dropping to a spot, eyes on the quarterback, and trying to evaluate where the ball is going, to what we call matching, where at any given point in time, you could be spot dropping. And then if someone crosses your eye, you're locking on to them. This is a big concept from Vic Fangio and Brandon Staley that really came across in the last couple of years and have been part of the reason why we've kind of seen the passing game, particularly for guys like Patrick Mahomes, kind of start coming in a little bit.
Is this maybe the difference? This the difference between like a Pat Surtain and a Derek Stingley, who Pat Surtain is not targeted very much at all. That's one of the ways in which he pops, right? If we go through some of these stats, his name is going to come up. Derek Stingley's targeted a ton, but he doesn't give up any catches. So
I think it 100% is. And I think the differences in defense kind of highlight that. And the question becomes is, will that continue on next year? Let's just think, hypothetically here. The Broncos have now added multiple different secondary pieces, including Hufanga, who was an all-pro safety. And then, they're adding in Jahdae Barron to that mix as well. does all of a sudden his target rate go up because of, there's not the hole at safety anymore. There's not the hole at the slot corner position. But does that really necessarily mean anything? So all of these kind of variables are what allow us to describe really well what's going on during the season. Pat Surtain is not being targeted. And that's a reason why he's a good player, because you literally can't target him. But then as it comes next year, you got to pick your poison somewhere. Perhaps they just target him because there's no other place to go.
Let me, okay, following up on that, because that's an interesting, let's just take him as an example.
Yeah.
So when he is targeted, which as we've established is infrequent, he gives up a lot of catches. Catch rate of 73%. That's real high. That's real high for someone of that caliber, right? That we're putting into this bucket, compared to Stingley, whose catch rate's 45. So does that tell us? What does that tell us? Because it could tell us that quarterbacks target him when there's a breakdown.
Right.
And then that's why, like, there's a reason that they targeted the receiver in those few times that they were like, I'm going to go there, which almost never happens. They're probably going there because something happened and they saw a chance to take advantage. And then they capitalize and they do take advantage. So how should we weight those, again, just going into those cornerbacks, saying, okay, so Stingley targeted a lot, low catch rate. Surtain targeted infrequently, high catch rate.
What immediately pops into my head as you're talking about this, Lindsay, is their target depth. Because if Surtain has basically taken an approach to the cornerback position and said, look, congratulations, you're going to get a yard or two, but I'm going to tackle you immediately. And then you're not beating me deep. And I don't have the numbers in front of me. I'm just saying, like, XYZ player has,
and they're very different.
Really?
To your point.
Exactly.
A dot for Surtain, 7.5. Stingley, 13.3. Yards after the catch for Surtain, 119. Stingley, 218.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So that indicates to me that Surtain, there's so many variables with these players. That's why cornerbacks are so hard to figure out. But that indicates to me that Surtain believes in his tackling, which ironically, it's not the stickiest stat, but we're in a zone when we're talking about cornerbacks where most everything is in the teens or in the 20s. Around the 40th percentile correlation is plays with tackles. And so if a player believes in his tackling ability, that indicates to me that, we'll give up the short stuff, we'll play it and tackle it, and you're not going to beat me deep. And when you think about how we approach EPA, and you think about in particular the run game, if you're giving up a yard or two and then making the play, it's not killer. Sure, I'll give that up at the expense of not getting beat deep, which is absolutely killer. And so it's interesting to see that different approach where it seems like Surtain is more, and I'd love to get, film perspectives of this and all this other great stuff that we have at SumerSports. But just as we're investigating it right now, it seems that Surtain's saying to himself, you know what? Congratulations. You may get a catch, but I'm going to tackle you immediately. Where Stingley is saying, I'm going to close on the ball. I'm a closer and I'm a playmaker. And it's interesting to see that those two all-pro guys have such differing approaches.
I'm also going to hear the difference in the competition that we know that they're locked into play year over year. So AFC West, think about the quarterbacks that are there and what their average depth of target is. Like even Patrick Mahomes this past year, really low ADOT, right? So you're paying him 2 times a year. AFC South, looking at the AFC South, I mean, brain goes to Anthony Richardson and some of the quarterbacks that they have there that are airing it out. So like there might be some reflection of their competition in these numbers to a degree, right?
Right. And I think we're breaking down all these things to kind of put some of the logic down to it of just how much has to go into any given evaluation of a cornerback. You have to think of how good the lines are that are blocking for the quarterbacks. And in retrospect, how good your defensive line is. Then you have to think about the quarterback. How much is he going to run versus pass? The quarterback, how deep is he going to throw? The wide receiver, how good is that wide receiver at running routes? How difficult is your assignment? Are you playing in the slot a lot? Are you playing on the outside a lot? Then we haven't even gotten to anything really defensively after the ball is snapped. You got to think of the different types of coverages that are being played, the weaknesses of the defense. And we talk about these weak link systems all the time. The defensive backfield really is a weak link system where if you have one major breakdown and there's one on almost every single play, I know people think that NFL players are perfect, but there's a breakdown on almost every single play, and the best quarterbacks take advantage of it. That can cause problems for you too. So I just listed out like 8 things, and I'm sure I'm missing some that all go into why these stats aren't majorly sticky, in particular for cornerbacks.
When I go through snap per target numbers and I tell you who the leaders are, I just want to rattle off some names here. So Pat Surtain had 682 snaps in coverage on 55 targets. It's 1 target for every 11 and a half snaps. Other leaders in this area, Christian Benford from Buffalo, AJ Terrell from Atlanta, Quinyon Mitchell from Philly. And those 4 guys are the only guys with a snap target number over 8. And then there's a bunch that are in the 7s, and then there's a bunch that are in the 6s. Does that feel like a list that you think feels right?
It does to a certain degree, but I want to flip it a little bit when you're looking at targets, like target rate. A guy like Alontae Taylor comes up a lot. Alontae Taylor plays almost exclusively in the slot. And so then the question becomes well, where is this player lining up? But for the most part, it does indicate to me, particularly if you're playing majority outside, that they're just not going to target you, for example.
Alontae Taylor is a name that came up several times negatively for me when I was looking through some of these numbers, which is interesting and kind of maybe is a good segue to some of the counting stats. Because, for instance, like pass breakups, you may feel differently. I don't love it because it's an upward counting stat. And I think it requires a large number of opportunity to get a high enough number to be impressive. And if they're throwing at you that much, you're probably doing something else that's not ideal to make the quarterback think I should throw the ball there. So as an example, if you put a high snap filter on so that we're only looking at people that are in coverage the most, the pass breakup leaders from last year are Zion McCollum from Tampa, Mike Jackson from Carolina, Derek Stingley from Houston, and Alontae Taylor from New Orleans. So I should point out here really quickly that if I lower the snap filter, some other big names pop up on this list. Is it Denzel Ward, the Darius Slays? But for purpose of just clarity, I'm going to keep this to the guys that are on the field the most for our sample. And then looking at that sample and then the target numbers for the 4 guys whose names I already mentioned, McCollum, Jackson, Stingley, Taylor. Every single one of them is in the top 10 of that subset for the most targeted. Alontae Taylor, the best example, 110 targets. That's the second most for that group of people. Allowed 72% of his targets to be caught for 998 yards, which is the highest number of yards allowed for the cornerbacks in this sample. So I'm feeling like pass breakups doesn't tell us someone is good. It's telling us that somebody has the ability maybe to make a big play. But then I'm left wondering, how much is that player costing the defense when they don't make the big play? So for me, and there are a number of other examples here. This is one upward counting stat. The interceptions is another one. There's other ones, but this is one that for me kind of popped as like, I don't know if I love that as a judge of a cornerback for a number of different reasons.
This was kind of the discussion last year that fascinated me about Byron Murphy, who ends up being, a Pro Bowl level player, ends up getting a really, really big contract, nice contract. And the refrain was always that he's asked to do a lot. But then at the same time, like when you're targeted a lot in the context of your defense and you're giving up a lot of catches, how good is that? And he wasn't really a great player when it came down to our coverage SumerScore throughout the year. And it felt like he was kind of the weak link of this defense for most of the year. And when you talk to Vikings people, they seem to feel the same. Now, consistency is key. And it's they consistently invested in their defense, and he knows the defense. Perhaps he'll continue developing the defense. And I am definitely not going to be the one to tell Brian Flores that he doesn't know what he's talking about, especially as I just went over and over again and said all these stats are not super sticky. But it does bring up questions about the descriptiveness of what's going on. And as you know, we love to investigate these things, Lindsay. When you start blending it in with what the scouts are thinking and what the coaches are thinking, I think it is a data point that you want to bring up. And if you are comfortable with that player being targeted a lot and with the rates at which that player is giving up production, then fantastic. Perhaps you're funneling it to a place that you think you'll win at. And sure enough, the Vikings were one of the better defenses in the league last year. You ask the guy to do something hard, he does the hard job at a rate that you're okay with, and then you feel good about it after that. But, you know, could you upgrade that position? Who knows?
What about interceptions? Are they different? Are they same?
So let's just like briefly touch on the pass breakups as well.
Okay.
They're not sticky. I mean, like we're talking 25% and less in terms of correlation, in terms of pass breakups, and then even less in terms of interceptions. So I really wouldn't expect Byron Murphy to have a crazy year in terms of interceptions next year, or interceptions per attempt. The rate of interceptions, wouldn't expect that to be crazy next year. I think the kind of poster child of this is Trayvon Diggs, who years ago was an all-pro, and then last year kind of had a pretty tough year and was blamed for a lot of the stuff that was going on, you know, rightfully or unrightfully, when it comes down to that Cowboys defense. And so for one, I think it's an incredible descriptive stat. I think if you have 10, 11 interceptions, you have been an immensely productive player in that year, and you cannot discount it. When we look at things like all pro, I think you should be rewarded for it. I just don't think that you can rely on a player to have that level of production in the next year.
Okay. Well, that's interesting, and also kind of matches what my gut told me was likely to be true, right? Mm-hmm. Is there anything else that is sticky for them that you think that we do need to highlight here?
It's really, really tough to say. I think there is some interesting stuff when it comes down to what we are tracking in terms of, you know, how much separation the player has, that I think is more descriptive when it comes down to it than predictive. But in general, I think this may be a position where any one stat may not be massively sticky, but when you kind of bring stats together and paint a picture and investigate what's going on, you may be able to glean a little bit more than any one single stat could do.
What about our SumerScore stuff? What pops there?
So I think basically what is interesting about our SumerScore is it looks quite literally at the geometry and the relationships of the play. And so while it is a good, you know, view of what is going on, as you get more and more and more and more data, it kind of lays in that same kind of place as a lot of the productions, which is targets per attempt, pass breakups, interceptions. It lays in that same kind of level of stickiness, which is indicating to me that, you know, results do matter when it comes to cornerbacks, but results are very rare. I'm talking about interceptions and pass breakups. And so we are really going to give you a big heads up when you make a big play. But on the aggregate, it's difficult for us, and it's even difficult for the AI to parse out what is going on without a massive training set. And just a year of training is not enough to get a great view of what that player will do the next year.
Some of the people who popped in our SumerScore are for coverage this year. I moved it up to a 500 snap sample because again, with most of these that are like rates or like, I just want to have a rough idea of, you know, who's actually on the field the most.
Right.
And then let's take a look at this for purposes of this conversation anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So if I put it at a 500 snap sample, that gives us 44 players. And number one on that list, I think, would surprise a ton of people. And that's
was it Garrett Williams from Arizona?
Yep. Yep. And he's more of a slot corner.
Mm-hmm.
So what he's asked to do is very specific.
Right.
That does raise a conversation about, I mean, you can be, well, let's have that conversation. So if you are a slot corner, what does that say about the way someone has assessed your ability? Like, are you lower on the cornerback totem pole than if you are an outside corner that is your primary job is to lock down the number one wide receiver on the outside? Or can you be one of the best cornerbacks in the NFL if you work primarily in the slot? How do you have that conversation?
So I think this is a really interesting conversation because, as we talked about with tight ends, for example, it's changing quickly and it's changing radically. And I want to highlight one specific part where a change of someone moving to the slot changed the whole face of a defense. So last year we covered it in excess. The Ravens defense in terms of the passing game was not very good until about the middle of the season, but they had the best running defense for most of the year. They moved Marlon Humphrey to the slot and moved Kyle Hamilton back off of the line where he was kind of playing more of a nickelback position for most of the year. All of a sudden, they become the best passing defense in the league, or one of the best. So it's difficult to say. I realize I'm not giving a bunch of straight answers, but the reality is it's just because there's so much going on and there's so much heady intelligence kind of being communicated from the defense coordinator to their defense and what is going on and how they're trying to confuse the offense when it comes to this type of stuff. And so you kind of have to look at it. Let's just take Arizona, for example. Not a very good defense, but Garrett Williams did a really good job. Does that mean that there's holes elsewhere? And he was kind of cutting off the middle of the field, which we have research from Stats and Scheme contributor Tage Seth indicating that the middle of the field is kind of the three-pointer of the of football. Was he doing that? I think probably so. And I think we should probably look into how he can move that on moving forward. And don't forget Trent McDuffie, who is now an all-pro level player, a guy who has been looked at as one of the best cornerbacks in the league, started off playing pretty much particularly in the slot of that Chiefs defense and causing a lot of problems. So it's not clear, but there definitely are some schemes where the slot player is kind of more of a package player. But as we move into a space where tight ends are going to be on the field and going to be able to be very effective wide receivers, / a lot of people like to play 11 personnel, you got to have a good slot cornerback. And so Garrett Williams indicates to me that he can be one of those top slot cornerback guys, just as Marlon Humphrey moved into the slot and was very effective as well.
Well, and also thinking about, again, the competition that we know is consistently there for the Arizona Cardinals. The other teams in the NFC West, you've got Seattle, and we had JSN in the slot.
Right.
The Rams, I mean, you've got good wide receivers going in the slot constantly there.
Right.
Like, that's a big part of how you would defend these two teams. Why am I blanking on the other team in the NFC West? Who am I leaving out? Seahawks, Rams,
Raiders.
Cardinals.
So you're having to deal with tight ends.
No, they're AFC. They're AFC.
Oh, NFC West. NFC West. I thought you said AFC. Yeah, the 49ers. So you're having to deal with Kittle, and you're having to deal with, Debo going in and out, and you're having to deal with Juwan Jennings, who ended up kind of being the X on that team. And then more so, not as much last year, but this year we're going to get a test because ideally McCaffrey will be healthy and will be kind of lining up in those spots as well.
Yeah, I mean, those three teams, I feel like it's kind of muddy, like where you would prioritize, like which one's more important, taking away the middle of the field and that guy that's going to work in that space, or the guy that's on the outside. From a defensive standpoint, I don't necessarily think that the guy that you put in the slot's any less important.
Yeah. And when we're talking about like values here, a lot of the time, like on average, when we're talking about Sumer scores, like a player isn't going to be targeted. So it's going to be hard. We're going to be able to get a great read, but that player isn't going to be able to absolutely knock it out of the park if a quarterback just takes one step, lets it rip down the right side, and that player's on the left side. So like it's just so difficult to get, even when you're looking at frame by frame bases of things, a read on, well, if the quarterback would have held it more, gotten a read 3, would the player have been able to, hang on to their coverage when you're what they call tail piping on cross routes. So you're like sticking to the back of someone's helmet stripes in order to potentially make a play on a crossing route. If, they threw it to the first read, don't even get a chance to figure out how well that player did that.
All right. Is there anything else that we need to cover here? Let me run through some of the other names from our Sumer score.
Yeah, let's do it.
Because I think that sparked an interesting conversation. Maybe some of these will also. Pat Surtanis too.
Yeah.
No surprise there. Kenny Moore from the Colts is number 3. Nate Wiggins, who's like the only cornerback we haven't mentioned from Baltimore, is number 4.
Well,
and then
again,
JC Horn is number 5.
Yeah, and I think let's talk about Nate Wiggins and JC Horn. JC Horn kind of locks in a good contract this year. Makes a lot of sense. Nate Wiggins played a lot more when that defense started to get good. So there is definitely some descriptive juice of what is happening when we're looking at these frame-by-frame things. It's just so difficult to say that, offenses aren't going to make major adjustments when playing that team next year that they couldn't have made on a week or two basis at the time that they faced some of those changes.
I do think it's interesting that 3 of the next 4 players on this list are from Philly. Quinyon Mitchell, Darius Slay, and Cooper DeJean, with Buffalo's Christian Benford in there also. Like all 3 of them, top 10.
Yeah.
I will also say that the last player in that 44-player sample is Alontae Taylor, who we brought up earlier, and who is also at the top of the pass breakup list.
Yeah, and
I feel like in order to make a point, I'm not trying to pick on him, but like he's turning into an example for some of the things that I'm talking about here.
And kind of a corollary to that is Paulson Adebo, who we're going to keep a close eye on, who has now switched to the Giants because, he wasn't fantastic in this stat either. And moreover, he was targeted a lot and not something we've talked about a ton, but was also penalized a lot. And so when you mix those 3 things together onto a team whose weakness was the defensive backfield last year and the New York Giants, even though they have added new, very scary pieces to their front, including Abdul Carter, you have to wonder if that's really an upgrade or if with the better pass rush, all of a sudden he and asked to do some different things, he becomes a better player. So that's another person to keep a close eye on when it comes to these things as we move into the early part of next season.
Let's move on. Is there anything else that you wanted to hit for the cornerbacks before we move on to the safeties and linebackers?
I think that covers it. I think we do a good job of being very descriptive, or as descriptive as we can with these players. It's just kind of the nature of the game of how difficult they are. And I think that to a certain degree, that's why, perchance the Browns traded out of the number 2 pick for Travis Hunter in advance of a guy who may be, in their view, a little bit more surefire of a defensive tackle who may, be able to have those sticky stats. College pro is always substantially trickier, but it is interesting to note that a team that's very analytical did make that decision.
Sam, let's move on to the linebackers and the safeties and why. You kind of mentioned it at the beginning.
Yeah.
Why this is a tougher position to find like a stat to tell the story. And by the way, there might be some correlation here to the fact that these are the lowest paid positions on the defense. And of course, we're talking about linebackers, not like the edge rusher linebacker like Micah Parsons, but a little bit more of like the traditional linebacker here.
Yeah, 100%. When we're talking about off the ball linebackers and safeties, you're kind of in the same boat when it comes to this stuff where they typically will have run fits, but they will have coverage assignments. Not a lot of sticky stats. And I think there's really a big lack of even descriptive stats to a certain degree when it comes to these players, because we can never kind of tell what their assignments are when it comes to play action, for example, where they're getting drawn in. And they're really the ones who are susceptible as kind of run first players, depending on where they're aligned at. And I think that's why they are very similar to running backs, because those kind of second level players do have to rely on defensive linemen to keep them clean. They do have to rely on getting an excellent vision of the play and an excellent recognition of the play to figure out what is going on. And so we try to figure out things like bite distance, which Tay Seth and Eric Eager have worked on. We try to get a sense of, how well
distance?
Bite distance. So the amount that on a play action, they are actually coming towards the ball and quote, playing the run or coming towards the line of scrimmage as compared to not. But even then, some teams have one guy who is committed to the run and another guy who is committed to the pass. The Minnesota Vikings are a great example of this with Ivan Pace and Blake Cashman. And so it gets really tricky to even figure out what these guys are trying to do on any given play, given that they have so much kind of overhead of what they're trying to do. And I think this is why, as you said, they're not paid super well. And also why the guys who have any level of longevity are just such a degree better than any of the guys who kind of get swapped around the league.
Is there a high turnover at this position in terms of the people that you would consider to be the best at the position year over year?
I mean, the best example, I don't really think there is. And I think there's typically we see guys who are young all of a sudden become great linebackers. There are a few kind of caveats there. But you think about a guy like Edge Cooper last year, who all of a sudden becomes an impact player and will probably, it seems like will be an impact player moving on. But I think the real testament to this is that Fred Warner, who did not have his best year, primarily because he was really terribly injured all year and played through it, ended up being an all-pro selection, even though the fact that he didn't have a great year, because it just was difficult to parse out how excellent any of these linebackers were. And one of my favorite players of all time, Shaq Leonard, had 3 great years, and then all of a sudden he was out of the league and was getting cut from teams like the Philadelphia Eagles. And so it's really difficult to pick up stickiness with any of these linebackers or safeties outside.
What does Zach Bond tell us?
Oh, yeah. And that's an even greater one. I mean, here's a guy who played inside and outside for the Saints, played alongside an excellent linebacking crew, which include Demario Davis, who year after year has been an excellent impact player, was not able to crack the field in Dennis Allen's defense, rushed the passer a little bit better at times on the outside, came in as an outside linebacker with upside at the inside linebacker position, then all of a sudden was asked to do completely different stuff, was picked up by the Eagles as a special teams guy. Bam, all of a sudden he's an all-pro. And, that's something that you typically would not see happen at any of the other positions other than maybe running back. And that's why I draw that kind of corollary between the two, because it's just really difficult to predict who will do what in what scheme.
Is there a way that the Eagles could have predicted? Is there something in his background that they could have found, even with tracking data, anything that we could look for in the future that could say, that didn't work there, but I think that might work here?
I think Bond in particular is probably the most difficult one to say that. I'm trying to think of some other examples, just because Bond at the college level was a pass rusher, and for like a little bit of his career with the Saints was a pass rusher, and frankly, when he was more effective with the Saints, was a pass rusher. And so when you move him to basically the Mike position, where all of a sudden, he's able to cover a lot of the field, perchance his special teams acumen was something that they were looking at, and his ranginess in that. But I mean, we're really parsing kind of for straws there. I'm trying to think of like limited subsets of things that you may be able to pick up from other teams, but it's just very rare to see those types of players, pop up. And moreover, there's no real indication from any of these statistics that Bond will reach the same level of success next year. As I said, Shaq Leonard was a guy who was an all-pro and then all of a sudden wasn't an all-pro and wasn't even on a team. And so it's kind of really difficult to figure out. And I think that's kind of the real risk with the Philadelphia Eagles this year that people have pointed out, is that, they benefited from rookies being really good and from all of a sudden having an all-pro best linebacker in the league out of nowhere. And they did that at positions that are really hard to predict year over year. And so there is kind of a risk there, or if not a risk, a less of a sure thing with their defense this year.
How frequently would you say, or how anomalous is it? Because it sounds like he is, while he did the things he was asked to do very, very well, a product of his environment in Philadelphia, like
Mm-hmm.
benefiting from the good players that he has around him and the fact that he's asked to do specific things and not more than that. How can we identify the linebackers that are the guys that are the gravity? And do you think that there are any that you can think of? I mean, Fred Warner is one that you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned that feels a little bit more in that vein. But there are certainly some good players around him too.
I mean, I'm trying to think of some guys who have switched teams, and a guy like Robert Spillane, who is now with New England, is going to be a real interesting test case of this because, he did not play a ton when he was a Steeler years ago. He was starting, 7, 4, 5 games if we're looking at 2020, 2021, 2022, respectively. But he did have some pretty good run defense years in those. And so, particularly, you're looking at 2021, he was very good in our pursuit numbers. And then he becomes, his final year, he was a very good run defender. And then he becomes a Raider and all of a sudden becomes a player who's worthy of a big contract. And I think Spillane was perchance a guy that may have made a difference on that Raiders defense. But then you're also talking about a guy like Max Crosby that is out there. And moreover, Max Crosby is playing every snap. And so, like, having played the linebacker position, I think people's ability to cover, particularly out of the backfield, makes them an impact player. And then if they're an excellent blitzer as well, and you have to kind of maintain a cognition of them no matter where they align, I think that makes them an impact player. So like Demario Davis, I think, is someone in the past has a game plan for no matter where he is, because he does have the capability to play the run, to blitz, and to cover. I think Edge Cooper is going to be very similar to that next year because he has kind of a 3-tool guy, can cover a little bit, can rush the passer, and can, come up and bang on run defense as well. And so I think you have to be able to kind of do it all for people to game plan for you. And then let's bump it back to the safety position. I think that's why Kyle Hamilton is such a problem, why Derwin James is such a problem, because they can do pretty much everything. And then I think then it goes to those guys who really succeed at roles. And I think those players are very defensive coordinator specific, more so than, reliant on the other players around them. And I think in particular, I think Bond is probably more tied to Vic Fangio than he would be to someone like Jalen Carter, for example, or, the young cornerbacks that they had out there. I think that's kind of how I would break it down.
Transitioning back into the safeties here, I think that that's an interesting. There are clearly different types of safeties, and safety's hard because even in our SumerScore stuff, it's like, do you judge them with a coverage metric? Or are you like looking to see how they are in coverage? Well, that's not what they're doing all the time. So there's a bunch of different things. This is one where it's very like, what did you ask this person to do?
Right.
And how frequently, and then how good are they? And then sometimes if they even don't look like they're good, then maybe is that misleading sometimes? Like, this one feels like it's very tough. And even just in terms of the examples, you mentioned a few there, like historically, I always go to like Ed Reed and Troy Polamalu and how different they were when they were the best safeties in the league. Like clearly it's almost like they played different positions, because they played the safety position so differently and were so special in different ways.
Interestingly, when we're talking about safeties, and I think this very much aligns with what you just said, Lindsay. Again, we're not talking super sticky stats. The tops are right around, 45%. But the amount of times that they are targeted is the highest one. And I think that comes back to what you said, which means, there are guys who are playing in coverage as real coverage players that are safeties. And then there's other players who are basically playing, along the line as a linebacker or playing blitzing a lot or something like that. And I think there is so many different types of archetypes of safeties that it really causes, question marks. That being said, we can list off, the players who cause absolute ruckuses and change the name. You just named Ed Reed. was a player who caused all kinds of problems. Names like Malcolm Jenkins pop up in my head. Tyrann Mathieu, who has been asked to do all kinds of things in his career, whether that was play the free safety position, whether that was basically play the nickel when he was with the Chiefs, whether that's do everything as he's kind of asked to do with the Saints. He's another guy that just pops up in our minds. And I think it's, again, very similar to that linebacker position where if you can either succeed at one thing, which is kind of tied to the defensive, which is kind of tied to defensive coordinator. For example, we saw Marcus Williams be an impact player when he was kind of the last line of defense for the Saints, and then all of a sudden moved to a different scheme with the Ravens and not really be able to contribute in the way that they wanted him to, especially on the contract that he was on, really be able to succeed. But we also see those players like Polamalu or like Budda Baker, for example, who can kind of do it all, or at least do something so effectively that it negates, some of the hindrances on the other side that really stand out when it comes to that stuff.
Right. Like Polamalu, who's a headhunter.
Exactly.
Like, just go find somebody, find the ball, like
right.
We're not going to put you in a specific box and say, this is what you have to do on a specific play. And there are other safeties where 100% that's going to be true. Are there any positions on the defense? This is what came to mind when you were talking about safety. Are there any that are exposed more than others early if they are not good at their job?
I think probably the cornerback position would be the one. I mean, we talked about
your outright beat.
Yeah. And I think we talked about the Giants, the Commanders come up in my mind as well when we're talking about guys like Emmanuel Forbes, for example. It was fairly clear when they hit their snap ratio that it wasn't going to be great, and they probably weren't going to come back from that. Deonte Banks, obviously, when I'm talking about the Giants, is the reference where they spend massive draft capital on a first-round pick on a player, and then all of a sudden it seems like that player can't really hang, and it's causing massive issues for a defense, and particularly for the Giants, who have such a good front seven, and it shows up in the statistics, yet have a pretty poor defense because of that. I think the cornerback or defensive backfield positions, particularly when they're asked to cover, is one where, it's not going to be great if it doesn't look good early.
So what I'm hearing here is that we need to come up with ways to better judge and evaluate tangibly safeties and linebackers.
Correct. And I think the best way to do it, or I guess here's what I'm trying to say is,
I'm looking for things for us to bring to the table here at Sumer, Sam.
100%. And I think what we need here and what I'm really interested in is an understanding of, number one, where these players are lining up. Number two, what these players are doing. And number three, kind of where the breakdown occurs or how much they're asked to do, the difficulty of what they are asked to do. And I think if you can build metrics that at least answer to a certain degree, and frankly, this is what we are currently doing at SumerSports over the summer. This is our big summer project. If you can blend those three things, I think you may get a better sense. The problem is that, the best defenses are the ones that confuse offenses, and thus alignment can be changed a lot, role can be changed a lot, and then obviously it's up to the quarterback, or it's up to the offensive line and running back or the offense coordinator to decide which parts of the defense will be tested. And so I think as time goes on and as we get better at identifying, certain geometries, which is what our AI seeks to do, and identifying, how hard different alignments are, I think that's the direction we need to get to.
And if anyone's listening, I know we got a lot of smart people that take in this show. So, any suggestions, send them our way. We're always open for different ways to look at some of this stuff. That's going to do it for our Sticky Stat series. I'm kind of sad that it's over, Sam. We'll have to revisit some of these topics next year and see if we've come up with different ways to look at some of them. And just as a reminder, if you're joining us for this show and you have not been along for the ride, we have covered all of the offensive positions in different buckets. Poor defense just got thrown into one show, all of the defense. But we did quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and offensive line. And those episodes are all available on YouTube and also wherever you get your podcast elsewhere on this feed, the SumerSports feed. So thank you so much for being with us. And I think that's going to do it for us for a little while. We're going to take a little bit of a break and then we'll be back to get you ready for the season.
I'm excited for the games, Lindsay. Now we have all this research. We have it on wax. We can go reference it back. And, when guys start to pop in target rate for wide receivers, we'll know, hey, that's probably going to continue to be sticky. We'll get to talk about it. We'll get to give some great
target rate or target share, because they're two different things.
That's a good point. Target share for wide receivers. And so as we get to revisit all these things, it's going to be really fun to bring these back up. And, I love the games, Lindsay. I love the games. And when we get to apply some of this great research we've done all summer and some of these great topics we talked about with the beauty of football on television or live in stadiums, that's what really gets me going. I'm really excited about it.
I know. And by the way, with some new tools that we will be able to tell you about shortly 100%. That you can use to further complement and enhance your football watching abilities. All of that still to come. Thank you so much for being with us, and hope you have a great rest of the summer, and we'll see you shortly.